Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes as we let the number increase. Welcome, everybody. We're going to crest over 100 participants and then we'll get started. We'll have some more filter in. All right, let's get going. My name is Emily Badix, and I am the Associate Director at the Longmore Institute on Disability at San Francisco State University. And we are incredibly pleased to be bringing you this event together with Project HEAL. A few access notes and just a little bit of info about Longmore. The Longmore Institute is an organization that is really committed to showcasing disability expertise and disability storytelling and trying to use that to revolutionize social views around disability. So this is the first event in a series that we're kicking off that is disability and underrepresentation, where we're really trying to bring that disability 201 conversation to areas where disability might not always come up in the conversation, as I think we will hear with the conversation about eating disorder treatments today. A few access notes. I'll do a quick audio description of myself. I'm a white woman in my 30s. I've got curly brown hair and I'm coming from an office space. There is a stream text link that's been provided in the chat. We'll have Zoom captioning available as well, but just in case you prefer that for a little bit more streamless captioning, that's available for you. You can also use the Q&A space because we've turned off chat today. Feel free to use that like it's a chat room. Tell us where you're joining from. Ask questions. We will have some time for some audience Q&A later in the program. So use that space as a community space. Lastly, I am pleased to introduce Rebecca, who's the Executive Director of Project HEAL. We are so very grateful that our Advisory Council member, Milton, who's our moderator today, suggested this partnership. And I am very grateful to be learning myself. So I will pass it over to you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. As Emily said, my name is Rebecca Ayer. I'm the CEO of Project HEAL. To describe myself, I'm a white woman, shoulder-length brown hair, I'm wearing a black blazer and a green top in my home office. I am a cisgender woman. I use she, her pronouns, and I live in Brooklyn. A little bit about Project HEAL. We are the leading eating disorder nonprofit in the United States that's focused on equitable access to care. So our mission is to break down systemic healthcare and financial barriers to healing. And our vision is that everyone would have access to the resources and opportunities they need to recover. And that becomes really complicated in our world in the United States, the way that some of our systems are set up, and specifically the eating disorder space is set up and how exclusionary it's been for a very long time, how homogenous it has been, and how small it really is to account for the number of people who have eating disorders. So our goal is to expand conversations, expand understanding, expand access, and expand representation. And a little bit about why we wanted to have this conversation. In 2021, 48% of our beneficiaries identified as disabled. That was one of the largest kind of sections of someone who had a marginalized identity within the eating disorder space. And it was a part of the conversation that we weren't having enough of, and that we didn't know enough about, and that we didn't spend as much time as we really obviously needed to in 2021. So I'm very, very excited to be having this conversation with Longmore, who understands a lot about this. I've learned a lot about this from who's one of the panelists today, who's on Project HEAL's board of directors, and from Milton, who I've been so honored to work with for the last 2 years, who has sat on Longmore Institute's board for the past 13 years, or sorry, since 2013. So that's 9 years now. What is time? So a little bit about Milton. I can't believe I have the pleasure to introduce this human being. He is a career educator, author, equity and inclusion consultant, thought leader, and community activist who partners with nonprofit organizations like Project HEAL, educational institutions, and global organizations to promote change, critical thinking, and improvements in the lives of others. He is so perfect to moderate this panel because he knows a lot about both Project HEAL and obviously the Longmore Institute. He has made my life and my mind so much better. Every time I hear him speak, my brain lights up, and I'm just a better human being. So I'm thrilled that you all get the opportunity to be led by him and to be asked questions by him, and to have this space that he is sure to create in this conversation. So without further ado, Milton Reynolds.
Thank you for the generous introduction, Rebecca. I appreciate that. It's been a pleasure working with you as well. So just to situate myself, again, I'm out here in California in San Leandro on historic Ohlone time. Just to give you a visual, I'm a sort of cocoa brown black man with shoulder length dreads and a salt and pepper beard, certainly trending more towards salt than pepper these days. But I'm super excited about this conversation. I've been sort of dreaming about this for a long time, and we've got a rockin' panel. So I'm really looking forward to getting things started. Just to give folks a sense of what's going to happen, rather than going through reading of bios, I'm going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves, share about 5 or 7 minutes about their story, how they came to the work, and the space that they inhabit within the work. And then we'll move into a conversation. Just a reminder about the order. Allilsa, you'll start first. Anna, you'll go second. And then we'll conclude with Mikey for the opening salvo, and then we'll reverse that order and we'll get the conversation cracking. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand it over to you, Allilsa, and tell us a little bit about yourself. We'd love
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's having a wonderful night. My name is Allilsa. My pronouns are she, he, they, interchangeably. I'm a brown queer person, non-binary. I'm wearing a white shirt, short black, dark hair, and my background is a white wall. I'm a mental health advocate, a disability advocate, and a consultant. Briefly, that's my work. And a little bit about my story. When I was young, I did have an eating disorder, anorexia specifically, but I didn't know. Unlike white folks, we see a lot of marketing, a lot of pictures, a lot of education, but it's very white-based, white pictures, white folks, and even if you were to gain access, it's very expensive, it's highly privileged. So I didn't have that privilege. I knew that and before I continue, I want to honor this space. And I want to hold space for folks that these conversations can be very triggering. I know even at times for me, they're still triggering. And I invite folks that if you have to, take a break from this conversation, please do so. If you have to, just turn this off, please do so. Self-care is number one. And if you need to reground or talk about it afterwards, my IMs, DMs is always open. Just wanted to say that before I continue. And so I remember calculating calories and exercising. Like I exercised 8, 9, sometimes 10 times a day. It was just on and on and on and on and on. And it wasn't until a friend sat me down, another brown person, and said, didn't even know about anorexia or bulimia or anything else. She just said, hey, I want to talk to you. I see your bones are coming out, and I'm really concerned about you. I'm really worried about you. I don't want to lose you. And again, at that time, I didn't know any of the terminology, but I knew that she cared for me. And so I started eating for her. I started surviving for her, not because I knew about any of the eating disorder. And it wasn't until years later, I would say maybe about 4 or 5 years later, where I started to learn through social media about different eating disorders. And again, even then, it didn't really resonate with me because I didn't see brown people. I definitely didn't see queer people. So it didn't really resonate with me. And it took a very long time for me to go into what folks call recovery. And until this day, I haven't recovered because I've never been in treatment. And I think that's so important to highlight, because for a lot of BIPOCs, there isn't this word recovery. There isn't treatment. That's very foreign in our cultures because we don't talk about it within the culture or outside of our culture for folks like myself. And then later on, which is, I think, important to talk about in relationship to this specific discussion, I was in college, later years, and this is how thinness culture is so ingrained in our society and is so messed up. I was suddenly losing weight rapidly. And I mean, I've lost like about 12 pounds in 1 week. And I was barely eating. Like all I ate sometimes through my whole day was a few pieces of sweet potatoes with avocado. That's it. And I went to the doctor and I was like, something's wrong. Something's wrong. And the doctors were like, no, that's great. You're losing all this weight. Hooray, you're losing all this weight. Keep going, keep going. I'm like, I'm dying. What are you talking about? I can feel it. I can sense it. I'm weak. I'm dizzy. I'm fainting. But thinness is like, it medically is like seen as a good thing. And even though I had dropped about close to almost 100 pounds, give or take 80 pounds within just 3 months, which is excessive, I never once had one doctor say, we should look into this. And I'm brown and I'm queer. So definitely there's barriers there in addition to that. But they were just rooting for me. I was dying, but they were rooting for me to continue to lose this weight. And it took for me to almost pass out and beg a doctor to really look into the situation. Long story short, it turns out my stomach was being compressed. So doctors were willing to leave me to die because thinness was placed above my health. And now here I am, the opposite. I can't walk because I have a disability. I have a rare condition called May-Thurner, where the iliac arteries cross over. And so I can't walk long distance, but overall I'm healthy, believe it or not. Like here I am, I'm fat, I'm happy, I'm healthy, but there's this obsession with weight, and the doctors are like, you got to lose weight. They're not taking into consideration the disability. They're not taking into consideration barriers. It's about this thinness. They don't look at everything else that's like my blood pressure being okay, my heart being okay, all of these other things. It's this hyper-focusedness and fat phobia that determines the rest of healthcare. And everything is based on this fat phobia. Oh, you're feeling this way. It's weight. You can't walk. It's weight. Everything is first weight. And I'm like, have you seen everything else though medically? That's really what you should be looking at. And so that's some of the things I wanted to share. And the last thing I wanted to share is when we do get offered a nutritionist, which by the way, for people of color is very rare to access, is 99.9% white. So their meals are I'm sorry to say this, unseasoned for us, for our culture. So I'm like, do you have recipes with plantains? Do you have recipes with yuca? Do you have, recipe with the things I like? No. So they're not culturally aware. They're not culturally informed. And even if you get access to these treatments, they're not culturally informed. So that's all I would say about, myself. And in terms of the work, I am very intersectional. If anyone follows me along, I don't really have one thing that I talk about because I'm very, very firm and a very high believer in intersectionality. I strongly believe that food justice intersects with eating disorder, which intersects with housing, which intersects with mental health, which intersects with queerness and so forth. And there's so many ways to look at this. And so that's this eating journey that I've had, and everything I've been through influences my work, but at an intersection, especially when it comes to food justice, which is what my work has been in the past few years, especially with the pandemic.
Thanks for getting us started, Jill. So let's transition to Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allilsa. I'm going to try really hard to follow you. My name's Anna. I am pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman with long blonde hair, sitting in an office chair next to my bed, as I have been for the last 2 years. I'm delighted to be with everyone. I am about to have my 15-year anniversary of being a registered dietitian. I became a dietitian with the singular desire of telling my younger sister, who struggled with an eating disorder, that she could get better because other people could be well. So I've dedicated my life. I'm very much a one-trick pony. I exclusively have worked with eating disorders and work with humans on their healing journeys now today. I started my work and had the good fortune of being placed. I live in the greater Boston area, and I worked in an eating disorder treatment facility that introduced me to all of the things that Allilsa was just talking about in terms of lacking cultural awareness in terms of food, lacking variety, lacking curiosity about who humans were beyond the experience of living with an eating disorder. As a dietitian, I took my job very, very, very seriously, of course, but didn't appreciate the extraordinarily intimate and deeply, deeply important nature of feeding another human and what it means to be a person who is offering food, who is saying, I am here to support you and let us nourish you in company and with support. So I've had the privilege of working in eating disorder treatment facilities. I've worked in a couple of them. I've had national leadership positions for different eating disorder organizations. If I had not developed the disability that I have right now, I believe that I would still be a residential dietitian. And I will get back to that in just a moment. Because it was a really soul-filling experience for me. That said, I have extraordinary recognition of the fact that healing is a privilege afforded to some, and it is a really important thing for us to have conversations about the fact that, yes, healing and recovery happens and harm reduction is a real thing, and if we're not talking about it, we are not thinking about the entire human experience. So if you're here and you are on your recovery journey, I'm so grateful that you are here, and I am so hopeful that you will take care of yourselves in the ways that are accessible to you. So a little bit about me. I have had the longest relationship I've had is the one that I have with my body. The second longest relationship that I have is the one that I have with multiple sclerosis. I am in my 30s now, and I was diagnosed with MS when I was 15. I will tell you, this pandemic has been really, really interesting in terms of my disease progression and my level of immune suppression and navigating this planet without a really functional immune system and with a body that doesn't move in ways that it once did has been really, really interesting. I'm superbly fortunate to have a private practice and to be able to support humans on an outpatient basis. I love my job. I feel so privileged to be able to work with the brave humans that I get to support. I sometimes hang out on Instagram, although I'm taking a week off because they deleted one of my posts and I'm angry, which is only going to harm me in the long run, but I don't make money on the internet. So, and I have to find a new way to make memes because right now I'm using Twitter as the platform and I have to change all of this. I have lots of things to think about. But I am a disabled practitioner and I had to leave my facility. I had to leave my national leadership role because none of the facilities in what is now very, very large national organization were accessible to my body. And at that point, I was a person using a cane. And this is a really big problem because I am a provider and I wouldn't have the experience that I do or, you know, the notoriety that I have been very fortunate to have. I wouldn't be speaking to you were it not for the fact that I wasn't disabled when I started my career. That in itself is a really big problem. And I think a lot about the clients who are not receiving adequate care because, I mean, the barriers are monumental. So I'm delighted to be here and have this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. Let's transition over to M.
Hi, everyone. My name is Reim Ifrach. My pronouns are they, them. I am a white genderqueer person sitting in a fun, colorful recliner chair with neon yellow hair and matching glasses. That is an important detail for everyone to note, please. If you learn nothing else, the hair and the glasses always match. I was probably unreasonably shocked that Rebecca asked me if I wanted to do this because I'm going to get really emotional and that's okay. Because my history with disabilities actually starts before I was born. So my mom, it was an older mom who was born with polio, who was in an iron lung as a baby and had a lot of medical trauma and social trauma growing up as a result. I'm emotional because my mom is one of my favorite humans on this planet, and it is hard to imagine a world in which she never was allowed to reach her full potential. And so I grew up with a mom that lied to us about having a disability and taught us from a really young age that when you're sick or you're in pain or you're disabled, you cannot let people know because they will judge you, they will marginalize you, and they will stop you from being successful. And so what that turned into was having a secret eating disorder and 3 chronic illnesses that would go undiagnosed for years, having bariatric surgery, being convinced that because I was struggling, that would make my disability and my illnesses go away. And it was all a lie. And I'm a white person. So if this is a lie I have faced, I am realistic about the lie that people that don't look like me have faced. My most recent chronic illness was not diagnosed until 2 weeks ago. I was unable to walk on a vacation, right? First vacation in 3 years. What a privilege. Got off a plane and couldn't walk. Have always used a cane. So luckily have a partner and a cane and people around me that know what the deal is. But I can walk today because I have access to health insurance and medication, and I have fierce allies and advocates, and I have a private practice and a full-time job at a treatment facility where I'm actually supported. And I'm going to be really honest, I know some of my people are on here, so I hope this is not shocking. I feel no loyalty to any treatment facility. Don't care if that's where my paycheck is coming from or not, but I do have loyalty to people. And when you tell people that you're going through this and they support you, you know that means something, and that you know that maybe parts of systems can change. And so I view my role in the world is convincing people that the real magic that we believe doesn't exist is with the BIPOC folks, the AAPI folks, the queer folks, the disabled folks. We are actually the weirdos with the magic that make things happen. And in that sense, I think it makes this panel incredibly beautiful and special in the cheesiest way possible. And I'm just really grateful to be here in community with all of you and able to share this with everybody. And hopefully some people will walk away from our panel knowing how to do better and how to do different.
Thanks, Em. Appreciate it. And Mikey, why don't you join the conversation?
Wow, okay. Having to follow everyone else. First, I just want to say, well, first, I am a light-skinned Black mixed race woman with short, dark, curly hair. I'm in front of a white background, which is actually the corner of my bedroom as well. So welcome into my room. And you can actually see one of my favorite pillows behind me that's blue and has funky yellow designs. And it's really hard to figure out how to do these things without crying or or re-traumatizing myself. I've had such an interesting journey to this specific moment in my life, and I guess my relationship with disability is actually a lot more recent than everyone else's here. I am from the Bronx, raised by single mother. I have an older sister, and like Allilsa said, which really got me because I saw so many parallels between our experiences. I didn't know that non-white people could have eating disorders. It was not a conscious thought that white people were the only ones who could have eating disorders, but it was something that I internalized over many years. And the result of that was that I didn't realize I had an eating disorder until the end of college. Right at, the point where I was about to graduate from Hunter College in New York, where I went to school, I was getting ready to move to Rhode Island and come to Brown, where I'm currently a PhD student at the School of Public Health. And I specialize in a lot of things, fat phobia, anti-Blackness, and sort of how they present themselves in healthcare, health education, health training, and health research especially. And I often focus on public health because I think it's one of the worst perpetrators of violence towards marginalized people in this world generally. And that was not something that I was aware of before I started my PhD program. And so now I'm in a very interesting position where I'm having to train within a system that is actively hostile to me, people I love, and other people who deserve to not be harmed just for existing. But I didn't realize that I had an eating disorder until I was ready to start my PhD program. And the reason for that is, even though I've been struggling with my eating disorder since at least since I was 10 years old. And I've expressed multiple times to multiple providers very worrying disordered behaviors that should have been in a very like bright red flag to anybody that was paying attention. None of those things were taken seriously because I am a fat Black person who lives in the body that I do. There were added barriers where like my family was very poor. If you're familiar at all with the Bronx, I lived in Eastchester Gardens projects. And so around that area, anybody who grew up in the hood knows the doctors you see are more likely to be like doctors that are doing their residencies and are going to leave in a few years. And there's all of this fragmented care that you get because the healthcare system's concept of serving marginalized communities is to give them the dregs that wealthier white people don't get. And so I was struggling with so many things, and I didn't realize that I was struggling because also living life as a fat Black person, I got used to suffering in silence. You suffer in silence because the moment you start to open up about something that you're struggling with, you're either ignored, which was most of my experiences, or you're criminalized or you're pathologized. And so it was much easier to just sort of suffer while I was trying to pretend that I was not incredibly stressed when it was time for dinner, or pretend that like I didn't have to force myself to eat, which I did regularly. Starting grad school was, I've said before that it's what broke me, but now that like I've had a moment to take a step back, I think it probably saved my life. Like 2 months into grad school, I woke up with like searing pain in my back. And since then, it's been a struggle to walk and stand and move. And so getting acquainted with my mobily limited, physically disabled body, as well as contending consciously with my eating disorder, and also having a growing consciousness about the combination of fat phobia and anti-Blackness that I've like been struggling with for my entire life. All of those things sort of collided, and then somehow I became a fat liberation activist and started educating other people about what fat phobia is, how anti-Blackness operates. And I definitely don't credit grad school for doing those things. I gave myself those things. Grad school is a horribly hostile place, and I don't recommend it to anyone. But becoming disabled was definitely a turn in my relationship with my body, a body that I had spent all my life sort of struggling against. And now I don't exactly feel like I'm not struggling, but at least I feel like I'm struggling with my body instead of against it. And that is a very big difference. Anybody who is disabled knows what I'm talking about. It's like, you don't ever come to terms with the fact that your body operates differently than other people's bodies do. But there is a difference between being actively hostile to yourself and grappling with the reality of being a disabled person. This pandemic has obviously been incredibly jarring because we've seen better than ever the incredible disregard that people have for disabled people and our lives. But I've still managed to have such an amazing community of people who feel strongly about not just disabled people's right to live, but like disabled people's right to thrive and have full lives and ask for more than the dregs, the bare minimum. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to be here and talk about all of these things together that don't often get to be talked about together. And yeah, I think that's it. I hope I didn't go over time.
No, we're all good. I mean, I think this conversation is just getting started. So thank you, everybody, for offering up such a rich and textured opening salvo. We're going to reverse order for the second question. So Micah, you're still on. But what I'd love to hear you all speak to, and you know, we'll shrink the time a little bit because there's a number of questions I'd love to get to and give us an opportunity to explore. But I'd love to hear each of you speak to the relationship between eating disorders and disabilities in ways that illuminate the intersections and the overlaps, but also that honor the distinctions. And then we'll get into a deeper conversation about the challenges of definitions, but let's see if we can't clarify the landscape a little bit. So I'd love to hear each of you speak to that. Mikey, it's all you. Take it away.
Yeah. So something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of the overlaps and distinctions between eating disorders and disabilities. My colleague, Deshawn Harrison, who is incredible, Deshawn said many times that health as a concept is something that's just defined in opposition to the existence and lives of fat Black folks. And we can so easily extend that to other kinds of quote unquote deviant embodiment like disability. And that idea that some of us can never be healthy because health is the opposite of who we inherently are, I think about it a lot in relation to the concept of like disordered eating and eating disorders. So for those of us who are like already disabled, especially if we're multiply marginalized, there's this aspect of disorderedness to everything we do in the eyes of other people because of our disabledness. Disabled people are already seen as broken and deficient. And so the ableism that we face creates this extra barrier for us to receive care for our disordered eating or eating disorders. But ultimately, even though like ableism and the very sort of, I don't want to say exclusive, but historically harmful and insulated space that eating disorders treatment and research and everything is, there's differences, right? Like, I think that there's a certain aspect to disability, some disabilities that, like, for me, I can't exactly hide the fact that I can't walk when I go outside. It's something that it's obvious. I move differently than other people. I'm visibly struggling, and it's something that makes being visible incredibly difficult. Whereas with my eating disorder, I've been able to essentially hide and relapse and re-relapse and restabilize and re-relapse and restabilize so many times over the course of my life. And honestly, it's really easy to hide when you're in a fat body because nobody guesses that you have an eating disorder. So I think for disabilities that can be more visible, not all are, but for disabilities that can be more visible, it like adds this extra layer of stigma that, especially if you are a fat Black person, for example, it's just like layers upon layers of targets that people can sort of throw darts at, and you get hurt because you're vulnerable due to the overlaps of these things. Yeah, but it's very interesting how, like, even though disabled people are seen as the sickest people that our society like has to offer, we are still so incredibly excluded from eating disorders care and research and just general thoughts about eating disorders. It boggles the mind, but like, that's what happens when your idea of sickness doesn't necessarily have that much to do with the sick experience, and it has more to do with the idea that someone is deficient because they don't function the way that everybody else does. So.
Thanks for getting started on that one, Mikey. I'd love to hear you speak to that same question. Again, thinking about the sort of relationship between eating disorders and disability that illuminates the intersections and overlaps, but also honors the distinctions.
Oh, my
So,
James.
Pardon me, Anna or M?
Actually, let M go, and then we'll go to you, Anna, and then we'll get to Allilsa. You're all right. You're all good. We're great.
Mikey, I'm really glad you brought up this idea of what health even means, because when I was thinking about this question, it was actually like, what is the definition of health, right? What does that actually mean? And what does that mean in my work? And then I was like, wait a minute, do I look at health wrong? Like there was an existential crisis that happened in this process that was actually really, really good. And it brought me to this. Health is another capitalist buzzword to keep us all suppressed, keep us all dumb, to keep us all thinking we have something to improve on, when the reality is, right? And I think, Anna, you're actually a great example. This pandemic meant you could do everything virtually. Why couldn't you have done that 2 years ago or when you first got diagnosed? Why now that the majority of people can't get access, do we create access for everybody? In my work, I run a fully virtual program. Why has that never existed before this pandemic? Why couldn't queer people and brown people and disabled people have gotten this before now? Oh, I'm sorry, because it inconvenienced the chosen few. Because when you look at who the majority is, on this panel, I'm actually looking at the majority, right? It's kind of a myth that the majority are wealthy, healthy, thin, cis white people. Like statistically, that's actually inaccurate. And so that makes me think of, well, yeah, eating disorder treatment actually helps the same chosen few that oppress those that are disabled. How can that not go hand in hand? No wonder all of us could not get the treatment we needed being in the bodies that we were in some way. The system is not built for us. And, you know, my hope as we move through this will always be when we can redefine what an eating disorder, what treatment and what healing from one means, we can actually redefine what a disability is and what health is and what should actually be accessible. And by definition, who should get it, which is all of us.
Thanks for that, Em. So Anna, it's all you.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you just said, Em, about health. And I think I'm going to actually respond to this in 2 ways. Firstly, I'm really terrified because the world is behaving as though the pandemic is done and like everything has been virtual, and that's so fantastic. And it was amazing when insurance was allowing me to see my clients virtually and paying for me to provide the service that I provided in person. And now they're telling me that I can't do that anymore if I'm not live. And it's like, but I'm disabled and I'm very frightened about, you know, this return to normal when there is no normal. And I want to just take a second to talk about the way that I think health, and particularly in the context of nutrition and the overlap of, so like in the disability community, or when speaking of the disability community, there is this kind of deficiency model that says that we are supposed to be striving to work to be not disabled. I've had MS for most of my life, and I am an educated dietitian. I know a lot about nutrition science. I know a lot about general health, and that hasn't prevented me from trying to heal myself from a disease because someone with the same disease wrote a book about how she healed herself from this incurable condition by virtue of food choice. And I am an anti-diet, anti-oppression dietitian. And I fell victim to someone promising me respite that was going to like give me this salvation to prevent the progression of my disability, to prevent me moving away from what was healthier into this less healthy place. And I think we are in such a muddy, like the waters are so muddy because right now the picture of health is like the equivalent of clean eating. And if you search for clean eating on social media, it's like brightly colored fruits and vegetables, white people, and athletic clothing. That's what you see when you search for clean eating. And that's what you see largely when you search for ideas about health. And so I think the overlap, the struggle that I see in my practice, people trying to combat eating disorders, trying to fight their way through this omnipresent messaging about how to be healthy, particularly in the context of surviving this pandemic that is still here. Even though I think I saw something that said that the pandemic was over, like declared by, like, it's not. But because of the messaging that we receive that says, if you do this, if you eat in this way, if you have this degree of privilege, you can prevent the side effects of being alive. We are, I mean, I am just sorry for anyone who is here and is struggling with navigating healthist messages right now. Healthism is the reason why disabled folks are not provided with equitable care and are not actually elevated in the way that we need to be. And I am just, fiery. I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Anna. And Allilsa, let's get you to close out, and then we're going to open it up after that.
Yeah, so going back to what I was saying earlier, and again, I want folks to be mindful. I mean, this conversation, no matter how reserved, I'll say this for myself, it can still be triggering. It's a conversation, whether it's too detailed, less detailed, it's just a triggering conversation. So I invite you to always self-care. So with that, speaking about earlier, I was sharing about, having lost that weight and not actually being taken seriously. And that's the intersection of disability. The actual thing that's going on in our body is so disregarded because the weight goes first. And to me, it's just, I don't understand how it's placed first. Like these doctors are causing harm, literally. They're allowing folks to die. And throughout the pandemic, speaking through the pandemic, as Anna mentioned, we saw this with the ventilators. They were like, oh, if you are above XYZ weight, you don't get the ventilators. We literally saw policies, legal forms that were created with the words, do not provide for people XYZ weight. And that just shows how the numbers have become so vital in the medical industry that they place them before humanity, that they place them before folks and their disabilities. And I was involved with part of the mutual aid work to fight against those policies and saying, this is discrimination. Point, period. This is discrimination. You're using numbers to commit genocide and eugenics. That's what that is. And we see that time and time again, which is why I was sharing my story, my personal story. I literally had a condition, but it was willing to be disregarded because the numbers are so fixated. And the medical industry is so focused on that. And speaking about the pandemic, we have to talk about homelessness. We have to talk about shelters. There is a lack of access to food. And this is where food justice comes in. Talk about triggering. When you're giving things that trigger you, because the shelters disregard your needs, disregard your disability, disregard the access to food, but then you go to the medical system and then it's punitive. You're to blame. You are the bad one. And again, the fixation with these numbers, the fixation with thinness and all of this. And it doesn't take into regards humanity. It doesn't take into regards disability. It doesn't take into regards what Em was saying earlier, that our bodies are unique and they move uniquely, they express uniquely, they're just unique, and it doesn't take that into consideration.
Yeah, thank you all for speaking to these issues in the way that you did. And what I'm going to try to do is maybe do a little bit of a gather and offer that up as somewhat of a pivot. I think one of the things that occurs to me is that regardless of whether they're talking about the eating disorder community or the disability community, is that both communities are grappling with the definitional implications and consequences of reductive rubrics of fitness, right? In my world, all roads lead to eugenics, right? Because when we actually understand the history of eugenics, we can actually recognize that this notion of fitness is very much tied to the national project of nation making. And that fitness is not simply just about physical fitness, but fitness for the commingling of gametes, right? So it's a sort of utopian forward vision in which those deemed literally unfit to share their gametes are also deemed in some ways to be unworthy and unwelcome, right? And so, and not therefore having access to the resources. So that has material impacts, it has psychological impacts, but it also has very profound social impacts, and you've all spoken to those distinctly. Having known that, I know there's some questions sort of merging up out of the chat box. One of the things I've been struck by in my work with the Longmore community is really understanding mutual aid and how communities, particularly communities of people who are marginalized and oftentimes navigating multiple marginalities, have developed these astounding and really creative and brilliant ways of providing self-care. Now, granted, we can certainly critique the fact that there's a need to do that, but that doesn't dismiss the power of those models and the importance of those models. And also that people don't have to always inform their caregivers about what they need, because when the care comes from community, community understands community. I would love, and we could sort of go sort of free form of this, I'd love to hear folks speak, like, how have you been gathering the community? And what sort of innovative responses have you seen emerge during this pandemic, which has been horrid, and actually in many cases is meant, you've spoken to, has been a eugenically filled response. So regardless of whether you're talking with the folks that are arguing for herd immunity, which is entirely dismissive of the fact that people have different degrees of vulnerability, even for those folks that wanted to administer towards towards collective health, we're still making hierarchical decisions about who was entitled to the kinds of medical devices. So whether people had a certain BMI or they had a certain kind of disability, that they might even have their respirators pulled. So these are really complex things. And I think the history of eugenics helps us to see the patterns and the structures a little bit more clearly. So how has the community responded? Because I think the power of the response is actually an important thing to lift up. So whoever's feeling the energy around that, feel free to step into the space. And if you'd like to sort of tag somebody else in, feel free to do so.
Oh, Mikey, you go ahead.
You go first.
So I'm going to speak more to my local community. So I'm in New Haven, Connecticut. For those of you that aren't familiar, there's a very large economic disparity here. There's those of us who live either in the hood or hood adjacent. And then there are those that are a part of the Yale community, right? Lots of affluence, lots of money, lots of access. We all share the same hospital. And so when this started, there was a group of eating disorder professionals that were more like-minded with me, that were like, we kind of need to do some kind of COVID-19 eating disorder mutual aid coalition locally for the duration of the pandemic to even teach our clients and our community how you talk at the hospital to make sure your ventilator isn't pulled, how you have power of attorney, things that we as queer folk, right, or as BIPOC folk, or as marginalized folk, as disabled folk, no one has these conversations with us. No one, I mean, luckily I have a single parent who can have these conversations with me when this all started, but most people do not have that. So a lot of it was us seeing how the system created gaps and going, how do we fill them, even if it's temporarily, and even if it's kind of with like some Elmer's glue and a rubber band that's broken and a paper clip, that's still better than no Elmer's glue, no rubber band, and no broken paper clip. And the kind of amazing thing for me that came out of it is then our local Pride Center started doing food drives where those that did not have immunocompromised issues would package food, would drop them off at places people could get them. Then it was disseminating pamphlets on how we talk when we are at the hospital, when we think that we might have COVID, where a ventilator might be possible. Then it was local lawyers that were saying that they would advocate for free for people. And right, that's, you know, it sounds like a great story. We know there are a lot of negatives to this, right? There were realities. People were pretty mad here. Black Lives Matter is very present in New Haven. We got a lot of backlash for that in particular during all of this, that really ruined the ability to congregate in any kind of way that meant disseminating information, food, or resources. And I found personally, in what is a small community, finding a few people with enough power to disseminate information virtually, right, using social media as best as we could. I do think it saved a few people from being pulled off a ventilator, ending up on one that they didn't need to. It certainly didn't save everybody that needed to be saved, but it was a start.
Thank you. Thank you. And would somebody else like to speak to mutual aid and how the community is able to respond and address the needs from within?
Yeah, I'm so glad we're talking about this, because I feel like the evolution of mutual aid over the course of the pandemic has definitely evolved. It was first, I have a lot of, well, okay. One of the weird things about being part of a group that's usually not given access to places like grad school is that I know a lot of people who struggle to understand a lot of the public health, quote unquote, information that the CDC was putting out, especially towards the earlier part of the pandemic, where it was just confusion all around. The public health professionals and organizations that are, I think, most influential in terms of, just like notoriety, CDC, WHO, whatever, they completely fumbled keeping people informed and connected to the evolution of the pandemic. And there was just a lot of confusion all around. So one of the things that I did a lot towards the earlier part of the pandemic was just literally break down what the most recent COVID information was to a lot of people. And this is something that started off very informal and then sort of spread. It started with, me breaking down probably, there had been whispers about COVID being airborne much earlier than the CDC. CDC technically still doesn't really acknowledge it, but whatever. And keeping people in the know started with me just like telling a friend who was just very confused and overwhelmed and scared because her dad was going through chemotherapy at the time. And so she was frightened about possibly getting her dad sick. And, I originally started breaking down the research to her, and then that spread into like a group chat where I would write a summary of precautions, instructions, and findings and updates, and then people would just sort of like forward it to anybody who needed it. And so that's like that was a very low energy way to sort of get into the more intense mutual aid work that I do now. Around the time of the protests, summer 2020, that was a lot of more bail fund oriented stuff. I had a lot of friends who were protesting that I was very worried about. And, you know, these informal social networks that we have are usually the easiest way to sort of fall into a mutual aid network where you have like your friends who usually check up on each other in a relational sense are now like, are you okay? Have you contacted this person? Do we know that they're alive? Do we know that they're not sick? Do we know that they're eating? And now that I've passed sort of that stage of mutual aid, I'm now into the stage of mutual aid where I'm in now, where the majority of the work that I do, that I get compensated for, whether that's writing or consulting or Patreon speaking engagements, etc. I have a system in which I have a portion of that money set aside that can then be redistributed to specific people who are part of larger mutual aid networks. And that has been crucial for people. I've always said that like more abolitionist work is obviously necessary. Like, yes, we should divest from the BMI. Yes, we absolutely should be terrorizing weight loss companies. Yes, perhaps we should be holding a die-in on the streets and occupying spaces that make it difficult for people with power to ignore us. But also we have to stay alive and fed in order for those things to take place. And so a lot of my work now is just making sure people have rent money, making sure people have food money. I have a group chat with a few friends that like 3 times a day, I'm texting them, hey, have you eaten? I have a few friends that the 3 of us just sort of like help people figure out what wiggle rooms they have in their budgets to like really stay afloat. And then we try to like figure out how we can reach the rest of that gap, you know, to make sure that they can feed themselves, feed their kids. It's pretty much whatever is needed. And a lot of these networks, like you said, that none of this is in person. This is all people that I've met online. A lot of the fat community that really identifies with fat as an identity, a lot of that exists online. It's not in person. And I definitely can't see people in person because, as I mentioned to, you know, a few people before the panel started, I got COVID last year. And the thought of potentially ending up on a ventilator while I was like struggling to breathe, and sick and weak was terrifying. And so I think that the main priority has just been helping my immunocompromised community folks just hunker down in place so that they are not potentially in a situation where care will be rationed. And that's been my priority. And thankfully, I think that there's been a real shift in fat activism over the past 2 years in particular, where I think things are slowly coalescing into something that is much more action oriented versus just education oriented or body positive or acceptance oriented. And we're really focusing on concrete actions. And mutual aid has just been, I think, the main focus at this point versus more direct actions that people typically associate with activism. Because ultimately, like I said before, in order for us to do those things, we have to stay alive. And even though some people are ready for the moment of the pandemic to be over, it's not over. It's still here. There are plenty of us who are terrified of getting sick. There are plenty of us who, if we get sick, we will die. And there's even more people who will get sick, become disabled, and then have to learn the very difficult lesson of why it's important to not do eugenics through lived experience of being disabled in a society and dealing with systems that are not ready or willing or wanting to accommodate them. Yeah, it's keeping people alive, keeping people fed, helping people shelter in place, but also aside from financial things, just helping people live their lives. I know that if I don't remind my friends to eat, I know some of them won't, because the nature of like ADHD, for example, is that hours pass me by and the next thing you know, it's nighttime and I haven't eaten a single thing and I feel horrible. And so even things like that are mutual aid. I think we should really expand our notion of what mutual aid is. It's not just money, it's not just redistribution, it's also just like care. Care in a way that is targeted towards people who need care the most, who are excluded from care's embrace the most, and that's marginalized people who are actively being harmed during this time by entities that claim to be working for us, which is not the case, but yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that, being on the ground and working on the ground, a lot of people with disabilities actually was left behind. And this is coming from a person, like I literally worked on the ground. So for supermarkets, folks had to stand in very long lines and people with disabilities couldn't do that. So what happens? They go without eating, or it triggers their eating disorders because it looks different for everybody. Homeless shelters, they literally, we saw this here in New York City, they would throw one box for over 100 people and they say, grab what you can. So many people were left without food. And they also had to figure it out for their kids. No money, they've lost their home, and now they don't have access to food. And when the government finally came through, which by the way was months into the pandemic, it was inaccessible food. It did not take into consideration if folks had issues with gluten, if folks had issues with bread or pasta, things that can trigger certain disabilities. Everything was very, well, figure it out yourselves. It was very inaccessible. And even with mutual aid, this is very important. We have to address disability, because oftentimes in mutual aid, what we saw, and by we, I mean disabled folks, was we were the last to be included. We were the last to be considered. We were the last to be thought of. And so the distribution was happening on the ground, like some folks were shopping and some folks were distributing, but they were not asking folks a very important question. And we should always ask that. What would you want to eat? And what can you eat? We cannot assume that folks can just eat whatever we think they're going to be able to eat. And that's taken into consideration culture. Out here, we actually had an organization, Mutual Aid, who was doing phenomenal work, and they were serving Washington Heights. They knew majority of the folks were brown folks, and they had a lot of Goya, Café Bustelo, very cultural products, because they knew that was more accessible. And we also, just to wrap it up, we also consider folks who had a dietitian eats, meaning in regards to maybe someone had a tube or a feeding tube. They're gonna need different access to food than Whole Foods. So these are things that we have to ask when we're creating mutual aid groups. It's phenomenal being on the ground and creating space, but we also have to consider disability when we're addressing mutual aid.
So thank you all for speaking to these issues with such sort of nuance and layers. We're up against the clock though, so we've got literally about 5 minutes left. I just want to read out a couple of the audience questions so you can, there's some good ones coming up. I know somebody earlier was asking a question about the relationship between sort of ableism and academia and how that might affect treatment and access, for the broader community. Another question that came up, and maybe these are things we ponder for a part 2 at some other point. Does anyone have any thoughts about nutrition in psych hospitals where it's difficult to get adequate nutrition for people with disabilities or dietary restrictions? Another really important question was lifted up. What can I do to get my managed care plan to stop demanding that I go on a diet-based diabetes treatment plan contradicted by my history of eating disorders? I'm not diabetic. My A1C and my BMI are barely at the limit for pre-diabetes, and I have a history of restrictive eating linked to quack, low carb diet, medical sort of industrial complex sort of things. So there's some really rich questions. We're not going to be able to get to them all, but I would like to maybe think about a lightning round sort of closure in 4 minutes. So we're really gonna have to sort of compress time. But what does success look like moving forward in your work, right? When we are successful in achieving some of the outcomes we're seeking, what does that look like moving forward? If folks can do that sort of a minute a piece, and I think I'm gonna get started with you, Anna, and then we'll move from Anna to M to Mikey and Allilsa. And so we'll try to do it a minute a piece. So if you could, that's my task.
Success to me looks like dramatically expanding conversation about, and I'm going to be, again, nutritionally specific, expanding conversation about nutrition and like what, health means, particularly when we're talking about the eating disorder community, because this is unique, this is individualized, and we need to be thinking about access more than we are thinking about like nutrient specifics. If you have access to enough food, which I pray that you do, I'm really not worried about I'm really, really, really wanting to wish you to, or urge you to not be worried about nutrition specifics.
So Em, you want to jump in? Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Or, I mean, the thing I'm reminded here most is sit down, shut up, and be humble first. Empathy second. And when that is all said and done, my job as someone who does have privilege within their skin color specifically is to create a space in which my voice is the one that will no longer be listened to in the eating disorder and the disability landscape, so that folks like Mikey and Allilsa are the ones that are actually finally listened to and given the recognition they deserve.
Thank you for that, Em. Mikey, how about you? Lightning round response.
Okay, lightning round. I want us to expand what we think eating disorders look like and also what recovery looks like. I saw somebody mention in the Q&A section of the thingy that they really have an issue with the whole listen to your body stuff because they're chronically ill and have pain. I also have chronic pain and I have issues with EDs, and I also have like a currently undiagnosed GI problem that makes eating and food very, very even more stressful for me. And I want us to back away from like these platitudes that have been repeated and regurgitated over and over and over again. And I want us to question the things that we believe about health. We don't need nutrition specifics. People just really need to eat. We don't need people to instruct us on how to eat. We really just need to be able to eat without shame and guilt, and also in a way that is compatible with our lifestyle. And we also don't need to replace our eating ways if they're not helpful to us. So we don't need to pathologize forms of eating that appear weird or are just not compatible with the white supremacist concept of health that we currently have. Like I said, people don't need to be told how to eat. They just need to be able to eat, and they need to have food to eat. And I really want us to make the shift to taking care of people's material needs versus trying to change them into a more acceptable version of their sickness.
Thank you. And so closing us out, lightning round, Allilsa.
Thanks. I would just like for folks to consider the lack of access for Black and Brown folks. As Mikey mentioned, that recovery looks different to diverse culture because we don't even have access. And taking into consideration culture when it comes to food, that looks very different for folks, especially we consider religion. And the last thing, to consider food justice when having the discussions of eating disorders, because as we've mentioned before, and I saw in the chat box, if you're being sent to the food bank, but you have a disability and yet the food triggers the disability, not really helpful. So we really have to consider food justice as well.
So thank you all. I mean, this has been a delightful panel. It's been a delight to be in conversation with you, and there are more questions to be had and more conversation to be had. So hopefully we can do it again. I just want to express with gratitude sort of my appreciation for Paul K. Longmore Institute, Project HEAL, and the work that all of you do. And I guess I'm going to go ahead and close it out and hand it back over to Emily, or just sit in silence as we shut it down. Thank you all for being here, participants. Wish we could have gotten a few more of your questions, but let's do it again.
Thank you all. Just a plug for the next event we have in this series, which is on May 6th, and you can register at tinyurl.com/disab-online. And that's an event with 3 online content creators that do disability justice work in online spaces and what it's like to be mentoring some of the younger generation. So we hope you will join us for that if you can. It's at noon Pacific time. And we will be sharing the video with all of you as well. There are a lot of folks who asked, how do I share this conversation with everybody I know, which is so great. So we will definitely get that to you as soon as we can add captioning to it. So thank you all so very much, and a happy week.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This is amazing.
Thanks all. Let's do it again.
Let's do it.